Okay, welcome everyone. This is Dan Stein from Stewards of Change. Dave Walsh. We're welcoming to the Let's Get Technical conversation today. We have a few slides we want to show and do some introductions, and then dive into the topic. The last time we spoke, we covered some other territory around identity management, and we posted some things onto the hub there. And what we talked about 2 weeks ago was to focus today's conversation on some data standards. And in particular, what has come up in prior conversations has been the topic of both the NIEM and FHIR standards, and if and how and where and when these standards are complementary or are running parallel, and or how to address these particular issues. And so that's going to be the topic of today's conversation. Let me just briefly run through our agenda here. As always, we just want to do a quick introduction from some new participants. I know that we have a few new people on here, so just to connect a voice and a name, because one of the things I'd like to do is to not only introduce people, but to invite people to participate in the conversation. This is not meant to be a webinar per se. It's meant to be, we'll present some materials, but then to engage in as much conversation as possible with a variety of different folks on the line here. We have some prepared materials to start the conversation, and then we'll dive into that. I want to do just a brief intro to the National Interoperability Collaborative, just for folks who are new to it. And then we'll dive into today's introductory comments, which will be done by Dave Walsh. We'll do just some introductory comments about the Let's Get Technical group, and then a quick overview of FHIR. Paul Wormley will talk a little bit about NIEM, and then Brian Hans will talk a little bit about the NIEM health domain and NIEM 4.0. And that should just provide a little bit of context. Most of the time, I hope we'll have an open dialogue and conversation, and then we'll reserve a little bit of time at the end for sort of a governance conversation around the hub and this particular group, in terms of the other topics we want to be discussing and kind of where we're headed and how and what the structure and the purpose of this group should be. Over the last couple of weeks, our membership, if you've gone to the hub, I'll show you in a moment, has exceeded 100 now. We started out with 20, 25 people, and now there's over signed up to be at least on the group itself, which shows a lot of interest from folks out there in the community. So with that, and then we'll, as I said, we'll talk about a little bit of along the governance of the group. So as we do this, it's just a little tricky, but if folks see the participant menu, if you haven't been on a call before, if you can just jump in and say hello, who you are, where you're from, that would be great. And we'll kind of do that in fairly rapid order. I think there's an order as we look at the participants on here. So let's go ahead and do that. And feel free to jump in, and certainly there's likely to be over people, but let's just give it a shot. So who'd like to start?
This is Jeff Wenth. I'm with CMA. We're a firm based out of the Albany, New York area, 30 years old. The company that is, focused in the state health and human services market. And one of the many pillars that we support include data orchestration and analytics. We're dealing more and more with existing clients that are looking to build new transformative business models that allow for coordination and collaboration across the continuum. And my interest today is in hearing more about the interoperability standards that would help us unify administrative, clinical, and social determinant type data sets for our clients.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks.
Hi, this is Joe Warren, and I work with ACF with Chris Trevor in the interoperability group, and I'm glad to join today.
Thanks so much. Welcome.
Hi, Daniel. This is Matt Engelhardt. I'm head of innovation at Mayan, based out of Lansing, Michigan. doing a lot of work in the FHIR interoperability test platform space, and I'm very excited to be invited, so thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, welcome.
Hi, this is Kate Ryan. I work for Iris Health Solutions, and I currently support the federal health architecture, and I'm the project manager for the NIEM Health Community of Interest.
Fantastic. Welcome.
And with that, I'll jump in. This is Brian Hanspicker with Iris Health Solutions, and I am the technical lead for NIEM Health, as well as the MC, we'll say it, for an upcoming NIEM Health Symposium, August 15th in Roslyn, Virginia.
Great. Thanks, Brian. You'll say a little bit more about that when we get to you later. I think it'll be real. Moving right along.
Hey, this is Haley Solser with Greater New Orleans Health Information Exchange. Glad to join today.
Thank you, Bailey.
This is Greg Bloom. I lead the Open Referral Initiative, which has developed interoperability protocols for resource directory information. And I'm looking forward to learn about patient and client information exchange protocols.
Great. Welcome. Welcome, Greg.
Dan Chavez, San Diego Health Connect, the public HIE in San Diego and Imperial counties.
Great. Welcome back.
Good morning. This is Grim Cochran. I'm the Executive Director for the California Association of Health Information Exchanges and also consult for a number of organizations, including the Medicaid Department out in California.
Thank you. Glad you made it. Thanks, Grim.
Hi, this is Carrie Hoff. I'm with the County of San Diego.
Back, Carrie. New folks? Anyone new you haven't heard from yet?
Hi, this is Lauren Ward with Levitt Partners. I'm excited to join you guys today.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hey, Daniel, this is Mark Vathiades at ONC, Office of the National Coordinator over at HHS. Glad to join you today.
Thanks, Mark. Glad you can join us. Great. Anyone else? Okay, great. So welcome everybody. And I said I'm just going to spend just a couple minutes here. I think the housekeeping stuff is pretty usual. There is a chat box. We got pretty active on that last time. You can raise your hand or just be able to just jump in and say you got something to say if it's not an opening. I suggest that people, when they speak, to wait a moment afterward and wait to see if people have a comment. Coordinating this kind of conversation online, as you all know, is a little challenging, but I think inviting more conversation, the better. So very, very briefly, for a couple of people who are new to it, the National Interoperability Collaborative, which has been leading these conversations, both in Let's Get Technical, but other areas, social determinants, confidentiality, and opioids, is an outgrowth work that we've been doing, funded by the Kresge Foundation. And that work is to develop what we're calling a community of networks. It's trying to, you're traveling or outside, put yourself on mute. Thank you very much. Somebody's out there. Thank you. That's great. So the community of networks is really designed to try to increase collaboration both within and across multiple domains and disciplines, including human services, public health, education, public safety, emergency medical response, healthcare, and others. It's an ambitious, bold idea, but we felt there was a need to have that kind of opportunity for people to be talking not only within each domain, which we're doing, but also across domains. And that idea is evolving and seems to have a lot of traction as we look at things like person-centered care or value-based care or social determinants. We really need to facilitate across domains. There's a paper we wrote for HIMSS about a year and a half ago that talks about those domains and tries to outline them and the commonalities. You can read more. Very briefly, some of the other stuff we're doing is we convene people We focus on facilitation across domains. We've been doing environmental scans, publishing, and making recommendations about cross-sector, cross-domain kinds of things, and have been involved with some work around specific case studies and playbooks, including prevention and upcoming this year, confidentiality and privacy. We've also been developing some regional chapters in New England, amongst the 6 New England states, and then also amongst others like in California, where we held an event last year. And we've been doing both education, some consultation, training, and mostly as well, keeping people together, bringing people together on virtual formats like this. We also do some national and regional convenings, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you guys at various events coming up at the Medicaid conference and HIMSS and some other things like that. So it's a community that is intending to bring people together and hopefully provide a home that is unique and valuable to folks. A lot of members. We have over 500 members now. We have a very high engagement rate. And we've had, interestingly enough, since we launched a year ago, these numbers are actually a little dated. We've actually had over 50,000 page views. So when people are coming to the site, they're actually spending time reading, and they're engaging both online and with other members. So it seems to be a pretty vital resource for folks, which is encouraging. We do encourage other people to be participating with adding content to it as part of your daily lives, and know how busy people are and how many different places you can add content. But as it strikes you, we certainly welcome your participation through forums and blogs and things like that. And with that, I'm going to realize that I have picked up the wrong slide deck here. I'm going to go back to it, but what I want to do is just introduce while I'm changing out the slide deck. We actually don't have very many slides we're talking about here, but I would like to introduce Dave Walsh, who is the co-facilitator and lead on the Let's Get Technical group. And Dave, please take it away and do some introductions, and let's start up the conversation as we talked about. Okay. I hope you're there because you're not speaking.
Yeah, I'm here now. Sorry.
Okay.
So for folks that don't know me, I know a good number of people on the call. My background is in healthcare and have worked with Daniel over the years in presentations and demonstrations with a group that we've both been involved with, the MITA TAC or MITA Technical Architecture Committee. And our way of approaching things really has been to have discussions about particular technologies and how to implement them to solve business problems, mostly in the Medicaid domain. But now we're taking that model and trying to leverage lessons learned into the Let's Get Technical group going forward. So can you, Daniel, can you get to the slides or?
I'm going to, I think you should talk. Let me just try to pull them up here.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Keep going, Dave.
Yeah. So the goal is really to have discussions with this group about the various standards and initiatives moving forward, and then engage with people in this group on building proof of concept implementations. And the goal there is really to understand in some depth the technologies and how to use them. And that's worked well for us in the past with the MITA TAC. As a matter of fact, Matt Engelhardt, who is with MyHIN on this call, has been very much involved with it, with the MyHIN group, developing some personas that we're going to be demonstrating in conjunction with Stewart's and Daniel and so forth at the upcoming Medicaid Enterprise Systems Conference. So just to give you a little bit of our approach, our concept, and so forth, again, is using proof of concept implementations. And on this slide, I talk about, or have designated there, the Blue Button project, which came out of CMS. And what the Blue Button project was an implementation of FHIR resources. And you can think of resources as specific records and record types in the FHIR domain. And what CMS did with the Blue Button project was actually implemented a repository of many explanation of benefits for CMS Medicare recipients. And the goal was to make APIs available so that the industry could do innovative things with it. And as a part of the TAC, we did a mobile app that allows you to get to the manufactured explanation of benefits, which is all false data, fake data, if you will, to be able to get to that and be able to generate innovative applications doing that. And if you are in Medicare, you can actually get to your information. So what it did was allowed us to understand more about something called Smart on FHIR, which is a way of authenticating and authorizing a user into the system, being able to access the system information and so forth. So it's a great model of CMS putting up an implementation that others can use and be creative and innovative in implementing that. So recently, there has been a number of proposed rules that have come out of both CMS and ONC, and I think it's Mark that's on the line from ONC on this call. But there will be a flurry of activity as the year goes on in the FHIR domain, primarily in the FHIR domain, to align with the rules that are being published by both CMS and ONC. And at this point, we think we have some pretty aggressive timelines to be able to go do that. I would expect that they may be softened over time, but it is certainly the approach to sharing healthcare data. Now, when we start to look at human services or the social determinants, it's less clear that FHIR is going to be used for exchanging that information. So one of the tasks of this Let's Get Technical group is to evaluate other standards, which we'll be talking about on this call, something called the NIEM standard, and both Brian and Paul are going to talk about that a little bit more, and to see if we should incorporate the NIEM standards into our efforts. So Daniel, can you go to the next slide, please?
I'm trying.
Okay. That's talking about the FHIR standards and a little bit about the NIEM standards. One of the things that is true is that the FHIR standards address two things. The data model, what does the information that's being exchanged look like? And that can be delivered in either XML format or JSON format. And there are some exchanges that are going to be developed for FHIR. I'll use one specific example, and that's the Gravity project, that is going to be addressing the social determinants of health. So there will be human services involved in some of that as well. So in the data model, you certainly will have all of the HL7 FHIR transactions and more, and we'll start to dive more into the human services and social determinants. The one thing that FHIR has pretty well defined that isn't as well defined in NIEM is the transport of the data. How do you move the data from point A to point B? And that in the FHIR domain is addressed with RESTful interfaces. It's an approach that dominates the web right now, but it also addresses things like authentication and authorization. So authentication being, is this really Daniel Stein who is asking to use the system? And then with authorization, we look at what specifically can Daniel Stein do with the data he's accessing. So FHIR has those capabilities for the transport, the security. It's generally talked about as smart on FHIR. NIEM, to the best of my knowledge, does not have those capabilities. So one of the discussions that I think we'll be having is, can we use the FHIR transports for transporting the NIEM messages? So can we have a hybrid approach to that? And I'm sure that either Brian or Paul can talk about that a little more. Daniel, can you go to the next slide, please?
Dave, can we stay here for a sec, please? Dan Chavez here.
Sure, Dan.
I mean, is it worth noting on this slide that FHIR really is HL7? I don't know if that helps or not, but FHIR isn't its own. It's a form of HL7. So if you get back to its roots, again, for purposes of documentation and clarity, so we're clear to other folks who may not have the deep healthcare background, is that worth noting?
I think it's very much worth noting.
You could almost think of it as HL7v4. So given HL7v3, maybe the rebranding was a good idea.
That's a good point. That's a good point. But yeah,
right.
To Dan's point, it is absolutely at its root HL7.
The one thing I would add here is, one of the things we're trying to do here, sort of an unnatural act, is have the conversation, and there are people on the call here are, again, more from the social and human services side, some more from the health side, and others from other places, public health and other places like that. I should have said this more up front. We're introducing language and vocabulary and ideas that many people may have heard of, maybe a bunch of people are probably expert in, and we're trying to introduce them in a way that we can speak some of the same language as well. So on one hand, it's an introduction. On the other hand, we want to go deeper into the specifics of each, but we need to understand sort of the requirements and the needs of the various domains in terms of what they need to share, what they want to share, and how best to accomplish that. So like Dan, I appreciate you adding that in, and I would encourage others, both if you have questions that go deeper into what this is or what the NIEM site is to speak up and ask your questions and or add commentary to it. So it's both a learning and also kind of a deeper dive that we're trying to accomplish at the same time. And I think one of the things we may do is add sort of a FHIR primer and a NIEM primer to the website so people can get into it if they're interested in more detail.
And this is Brian, just clarification on the NIEM transport question. You are absolutely right that NIEM only defines a data model or domain-specific data models, but various domains, agencies, have their own reference architectures and their own approaches to exchanging it, usually web services and RESTful services. So nothing terribly exotic. And I love the idea of using FHIR transport for NIEM, since it aligns very closely with what NIEM implementations have done.
Thanks, Brian.
This is one more comment about HL7 and FHIR. One thing I would note, if folks are only aware of the older HL7 policies where you had to be a member to, view the specifications or any of that sort of thing, I do want to point out that HL7 has declared that FHIR will be open, and so all of that stuff is accessible to everyone, even folks who are not institutional members. So I think that that's a very important consideration, that everyone can access FHIR and everyone can use FHIR. It's not locked down. It's not only for use in healthcare. That's just been its biggest use case so far. So just throwing that out there. Thanks.
Thank you. And who was that?
Sorry, Crystal Snare from Washington State.
Hey, Chris.
Public health.
This is Carrie Hoff. Oh, sorry. This is Carrie Hoff, and I have a question for Dave. You mentioned authentication, but when you described it, it sounded like identity proofing. So could you clarify what you mean? Does in your context, when you use the word authentication, does it mean both?
No, actually, we've had a little bit of a conversation on that. That's the next set of issues here on this slide. We've kind of agreed that there are two areas. One is authentication. So is this person that's logging onto the system claiming to be Daniel Stein? Is it really Daniel Stein? And that can be addressed in a number of ways, with two-factor authentication, with a number of other approaches. And that's what we're talking about as authentication. We also have what we've decided to have as a separate work group, and that is the individual matching. So an example of that could be a patient that is known as David Walsh or David P. Walsh or Dave Walsh. So it's finding out, are these people that we're discussing, are they really the same person? So two different contexts. One is the authentication as you log onto the system, and the other is when you're looking at the data, is this a unique individual, and is it the same individual even though they go by different names?
Dave, this is Carrie. Dave, I'm actually talking about a third thing, and that is before credentials are issued, the identity proofing. So that is the claimant, if the claimant is trying to set up credentials as Carrie Hoff, is the claimant Carrie Hoff. So it's like before credentials are issued, and then typically authentication I use in the context of I've already got credentials and I'm authenticating in. And then the third piece would be mastering the records. So I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding how you're using those words. So that clears it up for me. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And Dan Chavez, is there anything you would like to add to that? I know you're a bit of an expert in this area.
No, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So we saw that as a big enough issue and different enough from some of the other things that we're approaching to set up a separate work group. And a part of that is going to be taking lessons learned in San Diego that Dan has uncovered, having discussions about those and what are the alternative approaches. So stay tuned. We're going to be setting up a separate work group to look at that specific set of issues themselves. The other thing that I think is going to be important is what do we do with the data once we share it? Because in the end, there has to be some value proposition to actually sharing the data. One set of issues that we're going to tackle is how do we share the data? What are the standards? What are people adopting and so forth? And educating this group as we go down that path. And again, what I was saying earlier, the way in which we hope to educate the people in this group is by actually implementing solutions using it. So getting really familiar with the technologies and how you do it. That's not to say that anybody on the group has to be coding, but there probably will be people who actually are helping to code proof of concept implementations and then have discussions about those. So as I look at sharing data, and I'm sure on this call, we can look at other reasons for sharing the data. One, of course, is operational, and how does one system share data with another system for operational reasons?
And I hope as part of that, it includes support for privacy/consent and the associated authorization mechanisms.
Yes, you're right. And a recent proof of concept that we're doing for this year's MES conference involves consent to share. So yes, we're definitely going down that path. But the other issue that I think we really want to consider is analytical reasons. How, if we're collecting this data, how can we add value to it through things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so forth? And certainly the goal there would be to separate that data into an analytical domain. It's generally bad practice to run analytics on operational systems. It impacts their performance and so forth. So one of the issues is once we start gathering this data, what is allowed to be done with that data? And how do we go do it? Things again like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so forth. That may impact some of the things we were talking about earlier of how FHIR works. It's much more transactional, much less about the analytics. So how do we extract the value of the data, and what are we allowed to do in that arena? So with
Dave,
yes.
Dan here. Dan here, if I may.
Yes.
On a previous comment with regards to consent, based on previous conversations, I guess I served this up to the whole group for comment, that we're looking at patient identity, patient record matching as one workflow and consent management as a related but separate workflow. They are related, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, but consent management and the challenges of consent management are a whole separate subject that stand on its own without the identity management, record location, record matching attributes that go into that workflow. Is that fair? The two are separate. They're tied together, but we're addressing them separately. Is that fair to the group?
I think that's an important component because we bump into obstacles, and this is Marcely Hancock. We bump into obstacles that by working together to help with the patient identity or our person that lives in our community, and then also be able to link or share, those are, and to authorize or to help each other to be able to identify. There's identity resolution, verification, and authorization, and they are separate. And so it helps for us to pull them apart separately because, to Dan's point, they require of different assurances, and that consent piece is the it's possible or not possible component.
Thanks, Marceline. So, yeah, I think that what we just heard with Dan and Marceline and others is the pattern that we hope to achieve with the Let's Get Technical group. There are a lot of people on these calls that know something about one facet of what we're doing, and bringing that all together into a real implementation is the goal, to be able to get the information from the experts, to be able to educate people who aren't yet experts in that arena, down to the level of detail where we can demonstrate something actually working. And again, Daniel Stein is going to be helping us at the MES conference do a proof of concept that we'll be demonstrating this August in Chicago. And with that being said, Paul, are you there? Paul Wormley?
I am indeed. Yes, sir.
Can I turn it over to you at this point, Paul?
Sure. Thank you, Dave. Dave asked me to spend a few minutes, and I know time is short, so I'm not going to be as elaborate as I might normally be, talking about what NIEM is and how it might be a cog in this whole architectural issue that we're describing about interoperability. And also leading up to the discussion of the way to find meaning and use in both FHIR and NIEM. But just for those who don't know, and many of you already know what I'm about to say, so I won't try to bore you too badly, but NIEM is fundamentally an attempt to foster semantic interoperability across domains, to deal with the problem of the meaning of data, the diverse meaning of data across domains, the harmonization of those meanings into a common understanding of what specific data components mean, the identification of authoritative sources for the values that are assigned to particular data components like race, gender, ethnicity, address, and other things. And then to put those data components into a data model that has really two sets of data components. One set of core data components that are important and common across multiple domains, ranging from justice to health and human services to international trade, to about a dozen different domains. And then a set of domain-specific components that are really of interest only to the various disciplines within a given domain, such as justice or health or human services. But NIEM also has a methodology associated with it on how to define exchanges and create serious standards for individual specific exchanges based on an analysis of a use case and a reference to the existing data components that are already defined in NIEM. But NIEM also has an exhaustive set of data rules for defining and naming data components that allows for the extension of the data model and creating constraints on the model. NIEM, like as was said about the new version of HL7, NIEM has always been open to the public and available. The model itself and all the tools that have been built to support it can be downloaded from NIEM.gov, even in Excel form on a spreadsheet, or the XML schema that was used to create all the model is downloadable as well. And NIEM also has a capability, has a UML capability, and as recently the capability to work with JSON as well as web services and XML. That's kind of the fast summary of it, and I'll certainly take questions, or if anybody wants to add to it, for the importance
Well,
and relevance of this discussion.
Paul, this is Brian. I don't know if I've succeeded, but I've shared at least one slide, or tried to share a slide of NIEM domains.
I haven't seen it, but I'm happy you did that.
Dan, is it coming across as shared?
No, it's not.
Okay, let me stop the share then.
Why don't you go ahead and send it to me, and I'll put it up theoretically.
Theoretically. All right.
All right. So, Paul, thank you much for that. As you said, are there other questions or thoughts? There may be a lot of people not familiar with NIEM, or who are familiar but have a perspective on it. And I know Brian will get into this in just a minute, a little bit, another quick overview.
Well, let me just add one thing to what I was talking about. I meant to mention the governance process of NIEM, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. That NIEM has been governed by a small steering committee consisting of the CIOs of Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health and Human Services, and more recently, DOD has taken over a program management role. But it's the CIOs of those four departments that are really formed by the steering committee. And then there are working committees that consist of state and local professionals as well as federal professionals that govern that harmonize the data and deal with the technical architecture of NIEM.
So, Paul, this is Dave. In your travels, have you heard much about NIEM versus FHIR, and people talking about NIEM moving forward in areas that FHIR is not addressing? Have you heard chat about that?
Not really. I think that subject is relatively new to most people that work, because the truth is that these interoperability visions that we have across all the 6 domains that are, part of the NIC are yet to be realized in a national way. Within domains, and many domains have played around with NIEM or are implementing NIEM. There's every state has some kind of project in NIEM. ACF has made NIEM a standard. The state of Virginia passed a law requiring NIEM to be the standard for interoperability across health and human services. So there's a law that's causing it, but it doesn't talk about how NIEM connects to FHIR. FHIR is still, in the course of human history, relatively new, even though the versions of HL7 have been prominent for many years. HL7 has been seen often as focusing on the transport layer, whereas NIEM has been sort of separately focused on the data layer of how do we get common understanding of data, and how does that get represented in translating between computer systems in a way that doesn't require human interaction to detect the nuances and the nitty-gritty details of what terms like case mean.
Mm-hmm. So how are we doing with our screen sharing?
Good. I'm going to pull up Brian's slide in just a second. I think, Paul, you've gotten right at we're getting right on the cusp of this. You have multiple different agencies or departments moving in one direction around standards, as you mentioned, including some of the human services ones and criminal justice, as well as others. And the question that comes to our mind in the conversations we've been having with lots of people is, do these come together? Are they complementary? Is there a moment in time where we should be thinking collectively about what's going to serve purposes of a person or a family or a community best? Because as social determinants has become so common now, and people are really thinking about how do we integrate social factors that are outside of a clinical ICD-10 code, what is the right way to do both structured and unstructured data so that we have a common view of, or a complete view of a person or a family. And that's really at the crux of it. So with that, let me just open it up. I'm going to get out of the screen and pull up Brian. Do you have, and then maybe you can do a brief introduction, Brian, and we can move forward, and then we'll move, after your brief comments, we can move more into conversation there.
Sure, sounds good. And forgive me, I'm just grabbing another cup of coffee. But I'm only 5 feet away from my desk, so.
All right. So go ahead and talk. I'll get this up and running as you're talking.
Sure.
Introduction here.
Hi, my name is Brian Hansbicker. I work for Iris Health Solutions. I am the technical lead for NIEM Health this past year, but I've got about 40 years of experience negotiating standards in dealing with all the religious wars that happen when you do that. So I have seen so many of these, no, my protocol is better than your protocol things, when in reality, it's a long continuum of evolution of protocols and standards. What usually helps best in getting a protocol to be adopted is to provide opportunities for federated or bridge-based support from multiple different protocols. For example, right now, even though FHIR is on fire in terms of enthusiasm for it and looking forward to using it in the future, because of meaningful use requirements before this spring, 95% of most healthcare-related systems still support HL7V 2.5.1, because that was the requirement for meaningful use up until the latest proposed rulemaking from the ONC. And as a consequence, well, as we look forward to, how do we support FHIR? We have to remember that we also have to support V2.5.1 and DICOM and a number of other healthcare protocols. Now, we step into the NIEM world, and as Paul has said, there are federal and state requirements for human services organizations, justice organizations, emergency management, et cetera, to use NIEM as their standard for at least data modeling for the data required to support their environment. And this is to ensure that information that's exchanged across agency borders, jurisdictional borders, system borders are understandable. And NIEM has 14 domains at the moment, but it also has a number of communities of interest and future development opportunities. And as you can see on this little wheel on your screen, it encompasses nearly every possible federal or state agency except healthcare. Healthcare, NIEM Health is a community of interest, and it's one that has not really gotten a whole lot of attention, partially because for each of these other domains, healthcare is just something that happens at the edges. Yet there are over 300 healthcare-related elements, physical healthcare-related elements that have been defined across 6 of these different agencies. And that's not including at least 64 different mental health-related elements that have been defined within NIEM already. The problem is that there's no indication that we can see that there's been any coordination in the definition of these healthcare elements across the various domains, nor any alignment with HL7 or other health IT standards. And this is where, next slide, please. This is where NIEM Health comes in. NIEM Health happens at the edges of domains. You know, healthcare is not critical to military operations or emergency management or justice, or, well, I wouldn't say human services, but it is clearly something that they each need to be able to collect or exchange in the process of doing the central work of their domain. At the same time, emergency management is not central to clinical healthcare and to clinical healthcare exchange. I would say that human services is probably the 800-pound gorilla in terms of the intersection between clinical health and the human services domain, specifically because of my past experience with New York State's Office of Children and Family Services, where we had a regulatory legal requirement to collect educational information, criminal justice information, family law information, and medical and prescription information associated with all the foster kids and juvenile justice clients, as well as disabled individuals under state care, et cetera. And most important, the legal requirement is that information must be stored independent of its original source system to ensure that when that child turns 18 or 21, that information can be handed over to them. Now that means that ACF-based agencies need to be able to collect medical records, but as you know, social services world is often starved of money. They can't afford to buy and maintain and keep up to date electronic health record systems. So they end up falling back to sending a caseworker out by car to a hospital or to the doctor's office to collect a printout of the child's medical records, bring it back, and then manually re-enter it into a case management system. And by the way, in the process, losing a lot of the consent context, et cetera. Not a big deal from a HIPAA privacy point of view, I should point out, because in this particular case, the case manager is acting as in loco parentis. They are basically the parent for the child from a legal standpoint. So no big deal that they've taken that information, but there's still an ethical requirement that that information should be, the consent information, the privacy sensitivity information should be maintained for those records. So obviously, if we can dramatically improve the ability for human services to take care of, in this particular case, foster kids or juvenile justice kids, if we can turn around and create a bridge between the electronic clinical health systems, such as FHIR, and the electronic mechanisms that human services organizations are required to use, such as NIEM. And that's where we talk about NIEM being at the edges. Go ahead.
Brian, this is Carrie from San Diego. I would also posit that the justice circle is not as much of an edge case as it appears in this graphic. And I would also further say that it should overlap with human services. I think there's a lot of movement, you know, with collaborative courts, with the amount of mental health care provided in jails and prisons, that clinical care has a really strong partnership and relationship across human services and justice. And so I think that's also more of an area of opportunity.
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
And this is just sort of a high-level logical view, not something intended to be physically accurate.
Dan Chavez here from San Diego, if I may. I hate to be a broken record, but I think we have to say, you know, HL7 and FHIR, because if we limit ourselves to FHIR, we're going to limit interoperability. Not everybody is FHIR ready, right? And
I agree. I think I said that about 5 minutes ago about HL7 v2.5.1 being 95% of the healthcare implementations.
Right. Fair enough. Again, but if we continue just to use FHIR only in our reference, right, then I'm afraid we're going to limit our ability to get this off the ground until the entire market is FHIR ready and FHIR prepared.
I agree, and I'm tempted to. Go ahead. Somebody else is trying to speak.
I was just going to, somebody notified or just kind of going on. Dan, could you just articulate that a little bit more in terms of the HL7 FHIR sort of Venn diagram, so to speak?
Well, again, I know we want to all be FHIR-based, and it's a reasonable goal. The market's not ready to do that, as Brian just articulated. You know, the vast majority of exchange is 90% previous versions of HL7. So again, I just don't want to limit our thinking that we're not going to support older versions of HL7. That's all.
I have an entirely separate presentation on the wonders of the Federal Health Information Model, which we will not get into today. But the whole point of it is the Federal Health Information Model says, here's how we align HL7V 2.5.1, FHIR, NIEM. If you want to talk about a person or a provider, here's how you map it into these other protocol and data definition standards. But we'll do that as another presentation some other time. I'll make Kate
look forward to it.
Presentation.
Great.
In any case, let me finish on this. Just, you know, the challenges here, I think I've already mentioned, is that, you know, these non-clinical, we've already got these 300 plus NIEM health-related definitions that aren't really mapped into any of the HL7 and FHIR standards. At the same time, the non-clinical domains don't have the money to invest in an EHR to simply, you know, jump into FHIR, jump into V2.5.1. So that raises the question of can we, over the course of the next, let's say, year, complete a mapping between HL7 / FHIR data definitions, resources, if you will, for FHIR, and NIEM elements, so that at least we know when somebody says person, that means this, and it maps into this other definition for person in HL7B, be whatever. And at the same time, can we create a prototype demonstration of a FHIR to NIEM, NIEM to FHIR bridge, and or as has been suggested by Dave, demonstrate NIEM being exchanged over a FHIR protocol. What NIEM does not do is it doesn't define any transport, but various domains have implemented their own architectures for the exchange. Most of them are web services or RESTful based, so they align pretty well with what FHIR is going to do anyway. And that's it for my little pitch.
Thanks
hey,
a lot.
Brian, this is Shivankar. Yeah, thanks for the information. So I just wanted to pick your brain on something. So the way I have experienced this is NIEM appears to me more of a taxonomy, right? And FHIR is more like a schema or a resource bundle. And while both of them are supporting composition, FHIR is really supporting that at a higher level, and that the entities or resources are more defined. In fact, if you look,
I disagree.
Yeah, no, before you disagree, let me complete what I'm saying.
Okay.
And then you can choose to disagree. NIEM, it seems, actually holds closer similarities to the earlier HL7 CDA, right? The clinical document architecture, which was there in 2.x in various forms. So do you not see a greater similarity between the way NIEM approaches this and CDA as compared to FHIR?
No, I don't. Actually, I think there's a very strong correlation between the approach that FHIR has taken in defining resources and the approach that NIEM has taken in defining elements. What is missing is a mapping between the FHIR resources and their equivalent NIEM elements. And those NIEM elements largely have been defined as XML, but there is now work that's been done to also be able to generate equivalent JSON.
Yeah. Yeah, so have you actually tried to define an exchange with JSON? Like,
yes.
Have you actually tried to author IEPD and implement an exchange with the JSON representation of NIEM?
We have not gone that far yet.
Yeah, I have tried, right? I had a client that wanted me to do that. And I can tell you very succinctly, it's not possible. It's not going to lead to a good result. NIEM is pretty much XML based. And the move towards JSON, yeah.
You've been working with older tools. The NIEM
it's not a matter of
committee has been working on remapping everything so that we can indeed generate JSON as well as XML.
Yes. So,
this is Crystal Snare. Could I jump in? I just wanted to say that I would agree with the speaker, but I missed your name, and I would like to chat with you afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Any chance you could repeat that?
Yeah. If you're asking about me, I'm Shubhankar Sarkar. I'm associate partner at IBM, and I work for Carrie Hoff at San Diego. So, yeah, by all means, you can speak to me later. But yeah, we did try to. Yeah, we actually, Brian, we used 2 or 3 different tools. It's not an issue with the tool itself, it's an issue with the modeling. And we did not make a lot of progress with JSON, but with XML, we could actually establish a pretty reasonable exchange at Los Angeles for child abuse prevention. And yeah, and the FHIR, on the other hand, we found is pretty much founded on RESTful principles and much more friendly towards JSON. So yeah, in my experience, NIEM was the heavy lift, whereas HL7 FHIR seemed to be much more easier to handle. Just my experience over 4 or 5 projects.
Well, I'll carry that feedback back into the NTAC, the NIEM Technical Architecture Committee, next week. And if you don't mind, I'll point one of our people back to you to see how this can be resolved.
Were you using release 4.1 of NIEM and when you did this analysis?
Yeah, we use release 4. I forget whether it was 4.1 or, but yeah, it was release 4, and that was back in 2017 or early 2018.
Yeah, we're up to version 4.2 beta this summer, and next year we'll be rolling out 5.0. And it may be that the issues that you're running into are going to be resolved in 5.0 rather than 4.1 or 4.2.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this is the right forum to speak of it, but we also found a lot of syntactical issues in the NIEM taxonomy files. Spent quite a bit of time troubleshooting, even the XML version. We finally were able to get it on the ground and make it working good, but the journey was not easy. There were several errors that we had to resolve along the way. On the other hand, the FHIR files were much more clean and seemed much more ready for use. So just some observations based on what work we have been doing over the last few years. And yeah, if you want someone to speak to me, if that's of any help, then I can definitely step up and try to share some of those materials.
Well, I can certainly empathize with you since I've spent a good deal of time this year doing a mapping between FHIR resources and new NIEM elements to match the requirements in the US CDI for 2019. And it's not easy. And there do need to be new definitions and some new improvements in existing NIEM elements in order to have a clean mapping.
Mr. Bunker, this is Daniel. If from your experience and knowledge now, if there were changes made to make it less cumbersome or less heavy lift, would that alter the way you would look at sort of the integration or the usage of existing NIEM standards in jurisdictions now? Or is it from your opinion, is it going to be a perpetual uphill battle? Is there something structurally?
Yes, so Dan, I'm the author and chief architect of the IBM Health and Human Services Integration Fabric. And I can tell you that at this time, all our APIs are HL7 FHIR based, and I don't see that changing. At least I don't see that changing anytime soon. However, if I'm faced with use cases that are intrinsically, justice related or emergency management related, I would be forced to look at NIEM. But then that would not be the first preference. I would still try to do it with HL7.
Daniel, can you put up the next slide?
Yeah, keep going, Smucker.
Yeah, so that's just how we are built out right now. That's how the foundation has been established, and yeah, we have a distinct preference for FHIR just because of the shorter time span and the efficiency that we see. For us to consider NIEM more aggressively, it would have to be a cross-domain use case involving many other things aside from health and human services. It would have to be cross-domain in the sense that, if we see emergency management and justice and all that stuff as part of the problem space, yes, then and only then we intend to look at NIEM.
Well, these are exactly the kinds of NIEM health scenarios that we've heard about and have been working on. When I first started working on NIEM health a year ago, one of my first statements was, it doesn't make any sense to use NIEM to exchange clinical information. You should be using HL7 to do that. However, the more I worked on NIEM health, the more I realized that NIEM health is not about exchanging clinical information. It's about exchanging information that is at these edge cases where the majority of the interaction is happening as an emergency management response or a substance abuse monitoring, a medical record exchange, substance abuse monitoring from within justice, by the way, and certain public health reporting issues that also happen to involve probably emergency management. So I think I agree with you violently that we shouldn't be using NIEM if we're talking about exchanging clinical information, but there are these other scenarios in which NIEM is centric to the response across multiple agencies that also happens to need the ability to exchange certain kinds of healthcare information.
If Dan Chavez here, if I may, and this is a great conversation, and I guess you actually, again, interestingly enough, may further our work in San Diego through this conversation. But to the point, I think it largely, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, it largely depends on where the incident is initiated. Is it initiated in healthcare, or is it initiated elsewhere? Right? And where that workflow starts determines a lot of the exchange requirements.
This is Marcelly. This is exactly where all the roadblocks end up coming back to. It's the location and the context and the vertical or the regulatory framework that restricts the information moving. So to minimize or not understand or not to document where that data is coming from, for what purpose and why, and on what network and what type of device, then we lose the ability to say yes, yes, yes when we want to, even if we have consent, if there's not that provenance story. So it all comes back to the event where the data was first created.
So this is Dave. One of the things that I would like to do is, I know we can't continue to extend these online conversations. It makes sense to me to start some conversations on the hub about what is practical. And from my perspective, I would like to target a proof of concept where we start those conversations about the feasibility of sharing data between NIEM domains and FHIR, and just get that conversation started that are broader than just a weekly call. So Dan, is that you that is showing the hub?
Surprise, yes, it is me.
Yeah. So I would like to see if we can start a conversation there to say, here's what could be practical in a proof of concept. And if we believe that NIEM has a place to move forward, then we start that conversation here about particular use cases that could be used in a proof of concept demonstration, but something where people can participate and get back on it after hours or whatever to see what the current thought process is. So open it up for discussion. Do people think that's generally a good idea? If our goal is to build proof of concepts that helps educate people, that helps learn from the people that do have the knowledge, and let's just say the scope of time until we have a initial proof of concept operational, maybe 9 months, 10 months, something like that, where we can start the dialogue, capture the thoughts, and start to move it forward. So I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts on that.
I think it's a good idea to do that, Dave, but I would suggest to you that it would be most helpful to try to focus the discussion on a couple of very specific, widely deployed use cases that will illustrate some of the issues that we've been talking about. As Brian mentioned, the cross-fertilization of domains is what we're trying to deal with here.
I agree. I think it's a great idea, but let's get focused.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that.
So this is Daniel. This is great. I think what I'm hearing here is actually a significant advancement of a kind of an ambiguous concept as we started the conversation, which it looks like, you know, for places, especially where NIEM is today, the dominant, or where it is the standard, that edge case, as you talked about, Brian and Shubhankar, if that becomes a focus, if what we're saying is maybe that's a starting place to say where it's got to interact, what are the best approaches to doing that, and to make that readily and knowable, without trying to boil the ocean of a general NIEM to FHIR or NIEM to HL7 connection or linkage, because that has real value. Because justice, between courts and justice, and behavioral health, and particularly child welfare, and I'm sure adult care and other places where those things come crashing together, the need to exchange protected information, timely basis is going to be really valuable. So I think focusing in on that will be helpful on one hand. On the other important point is for those, and Brian, maybe you can weigh in, or Paul, for those jurisdictions, and actually Joe Warren, if you're still on with us, we believe that there are other ACF, at least in the ACF world, looking at, maturing or developing NIEM standards for the exchange of information within some of the existing program areas. Maybe it's a time to sort of take a pause for a moment, or at least make sure that the decision making that's going on is aware of the challenges that Shubhankar so clearly articulated from this, generous experience, sharing his generous experience, or generously sharing his experience, so that we don't go down a route, or we go down a route with eyes wide open, so we don't go spend a whole bunch of time and energy and resources and find out that, gee, it really is a heavy lift. It's always going to be a heavy lift, or maybe it'll get better if there's better tools, but who knows? And time is limited, resources are limited, and people's attention and energy are limited. So I see there are two strands. One is, Dave, what you're talking about is kind of this use case, POC that could actually demonstrate and articulate that, particularly from justice. And then this larger conversation about, longer term, are these ideas being considered, and what are the real challenges if we really are going to try to move towards value-based care and social determinants? This is going to be critical to be able to exchange that information in a facile way, in an efficient, effective way. I think that'll be of great interest to a lot of people.
I would suggest, this is Brian, I would suggest that we start very small, because I know just how much work would be involved in, for instance, collecting medical records for a child in the foster care system. That's a huge lift.
Right.
Because, you got to collect everything, including oncology information. And I don't think oncology information has been defined yet for FHIR, at least last time I looked. But if we were to turn around and say, put together a request from NIEM to FHIR and a response from FHIR to NIEM, do you have any records associated with this particular individual? There we've got to solve the person identification issue, and at the same time we've got a very simple IEPD and FHIR response of saying, do you know this person, and do you have any records for them? And the answer should come back yes or no, and or a link to another a reference to actual records that you might be able to go and retrieve at some future point in the fullness of time when we can support the actual exchange of medical records between FHIR and NIEM.
So I absolutely agree with you there, Brian, on the start simple piece of it. One of the people that were on the call, he's had to drop off now, Matt from the Michigan Health Information Network, is really good at building synthetic data and personas and so forth. So I'd certainly like to get folks like that involved. Ideally, what I'd love to have is a cloud-based proof of concept that is simple to start out with and may grow over time, but something that people, just like the Blue Button project from CMS, people can actually get to it and learn from it and implement their own solutions in alignment.
Dan Chavez here. Can you bring up, Daniel, the PowerPoint with the use cases? Could you bring that back up, please?
Yep.
Hey, this is Haley Sulzer at Greater New Orleans Health Information Exchange, and we've been looking at applying. I don't think we're going to, though, for that ACF interoperability FOA. Is anybody else planning on applying to that? Because this is like the exact type of concept I think that they would be looking for.
I think you're right. This is Joe Warren. I'm with the ACF and I'm working on that.
Great.
But I think Dave, what you were talking about, if we could just document these from every aspect,
yeah.
Right? Again, depending on where these use cases get initiated, and then talk about the handoffs, even before we get to a proof of concept, I think that would be incredibly helpful, useful, illustrative, etc. I don't know what the rest of the group thinks, but if we can just take these, 4, 6, 9, 12, 15 use cases and just document them.
This is Brian. This is actually the, if you will, the table of contents for a separate presentation I've got. Attempting to document these, albeit at the current state of each of them, they're very high level. They're just descriptive. Who are the likely players, etc. I would love, in the fullness of time, for us to dive deeper into each and every one of these. And if I get your help in doing this, all of you helping out, it would be a great benefit to the nation. This presentation is going to be part of the upcoming NIEM Health Symposium on August 15th from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. At the Georgia Tech Research Institute Center in Roslyn, Virginia. And there, I think I've satisfied my advertisement requirement as well.
Thanks, Brian.
There is documentation of other use cases that meet these criteria. The IGES Institute and the Urban Institute did a study funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance under Chris Traver, who was then there, to look at justice to health exchanges and documented some 30 different use cases, again at fairly high levels, but they identified the specific exchanges.
I think it was about 26, and 3 of those are actually listed here on this scenarios overview. The reentry to community after incarceration, substance abuse rehab.
Yeah.
And let's see, the third one is, I don't know where it is, but yes, they're.
Well, let me jump in here a second. We have almost everybody has graciously remained on, and we took the bold move of extending this to an hour and a half call, which seems to like the right amount of time to present and then have conversation. A little background noise, if somebody can mute themselves, would be great. A little muting there. Thank you. It is. We're getting close to time, and I don't want to extend too much further. I would recommend. Again, we haven't really had the sort of the quote small g governance conversation around the group here, but I would suggest, given the momentum, the interest, that we maybe pick up the conversation next week on this slide, and maybe focus a little bit more on this conversation around, what would be a good use case, what would be a good POC, how would we want to outline that, so to speak, and maybe have a little bit more methodical conversation about, what would be most relevant to demonstrate and to articulate the importance of it. And I'll say Chris Traver was planning on being on this call today, and Joe, thank you for participating. You are not chopped liver. We appreciate your participation, but Chris says we got called away with a personal matter. So I know he's incredibly interested in this. And
if you'd like, Daniel, I will contribute the full presentation of this health scenarios catalog as a starting point for next week.
That would be great. Maybe we can prepare some words around it.
Everyone can beat the what out of it, because it's just a starting point.
So
that's very helpful.
That would be great if we can prepare a little bit of thoughts around that. again, I would encourage you, this is my sort of marketing promotion moment of just go to the hub, go to the group, add a comment. There's a Google Doc there for other topics to add to, but it would be my birthday wish, which is coming up in August, to see more out, sort of contribution. There's a ton of consumption, but I think this will be helpful as we start to sort of put out questions or ideas or recommendations or resources. And I know some of you have done that to engage with that. And Brian, thank you for contributing to that. We could put that up there. You'll also put up a notification about the meeting, which I think could become very valuable. So if people didn't get the details, they can catch it off of the hub there.
As soon as I get approval for the flyer, yeah, from my bosses, I will post it.
Yeah, there's been a couple of comments here. Greg, I know that you just added one here about sort of the anti-patterns. I would ask you to, just in the spirit of time here, is to add that question to the hub in the forum. And I think it's an important point about law enforcement and the actual challenges of, as I understand your question, the inadvertent use of information for other than intended purposes, I might say. So with that,
there we get back into that authorization and consent/privacy marking issue.
Right, not of course, incredibly important stuff, and Carrie in San Diego has really been leading the charge in a lot of ways on really driving that through with Shubhankar's help. And how do we do that? How do we articulate what that means? And how do we bring that? Every conversation we have is always around that. And I think we're mixing terms for sure. Creating more sort of precision to that will help us in the conversations and what it is we're hoping to accomplish there. So, I'm going to suggest that that's the topic for next week. Just for a moment longer, if anybody suggests that we do this for a shorter, I'm going to schedule for an hour and a half. And for those who can make it, that'll be great. I think we need the time. Maybe we can try to reserve a little bit of time next week to sort of think more about the group and this kind of cadence. Seems to be important and seems to be participants willing to participate, which is great. And we can sort of make some decisions or just keep going forward on that basis. Last comments, Dave, Paul, Brian, Dan, Shubhankar, anybody?
All right, this is a good approach. Let's do it.
Great.
Ship it.
Great. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining. Have a great weekend. I'll send out the meeting notification if I haven't already done that next week, and maybe we can open it up with some more open conversations as we get started. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your participation.
Safe
Thank
travel.
you. Bye-bye.